Welcome to lecture number 4, Constitutional War Powers and the Enemy Within. I find this one's a particularly interesting one to me. When I was, years ago, first studying the Constitution, as I began to get to know the Constitution more in depth, I found that there were some of my political views that I held very strongly that I found were in conflict with the Constitution. And this was a great time of introspection for myself to weigh my own views and see why I believed them and how they compared with the views of the Founding Fathers. And in the end, I concluded the Founding Fathers were right and I was wrong. In fact, I want to go to this slide for just a moment. The American flag here, I want to symbolize for a moment the Pledge of Allegiance, because I believe the Pledge of Allegiance really gives us some guide into a proper attitude when we're studying the Constitution and find our views might be a little in conflict with it. That when we pledge our allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, when we're pledging our allegiance to the republic, the first question I ask is, what republic? And the answer that I come up with is the republic that is defined by two things. It's built on the foundation of the Declaration of Independence and the principles in there. And then the structure built on that foundation is the U.S. Constitution, which defines our republic, those two documents. And so when I pledge my allegiance to the republic, I'm literally pledging my allegiance to those principles within the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And if that's where my allegiance is, then my allegiance is not to any political party or to any political candidate or any media talk show host or other media pundit. My allegiance is first to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In fact, even though I'm employed by the John Birch Society, my allegiance is not to the John Birch Society. I came to them because of their adherence to those principles, not the other way around. They didn't guide me to the Constitution. I first fell in love with the principles of the Constitution, and then I've sought to work with any groups and organizations who will help reinstate the Constitution and the principles of liberty. And so if any of the groups or individuals that I've supported ever deviate from that, if I really mean my oath, pledging my allegiance to the Constitution, then I'm sticking with the Constitution. With that in mind, there's a great speech that many of you are probably familiar with by Patrick Henry, the conclusion of which you may remember, "Give me liberty or give me death." He gives us a great viewpoint, a great attitude towards this as well, where he says, "We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren until she transforms us into beasts." When something's uncomfortable, painful truth, we often don't want to know. Oftentimes people would rather, don't tell me, I don't really want to know. But then he challenges that viewpoint. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? And then he gives his attitude, which is just the opposite. He says, "For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it." And that's certainly a far more wise position to be taking. Go ahead, I do need to know the truth, no matter how painful it is, because we must provide for it. We must prepare for it. In the case of fighting for liberty, it's important that we understand the principles of liberty, that we can defend them, and that we can recognize those who are hostile to those principles of liberty. I found personally that some people that I had voted for and supported, as I got to understand the Constitution better, I recognized that they are not supporting the Constitution. And I kind of had to repent of some of the votes I'd made, supporting people that don't support these principles. And so by knowing the truth, it has helped me be able to provide for that knowledge, to be able to prepare and to defend liberty better. So with that basis, I want to talk about some of these principles that we're pledging our allegiance to, starting with the Declaration of Independence. You're probably familiar with the second paragraph where it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Now the next one, the next line, which is a little less commonly known, gives us a definition for the purpose of government. And I recommend when you're interviewing someone that's running for office, ask them that question. In your view, what do you feel is the purpose of government? Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, gave us a great definition. He said that to secure these rights, these God-given, unalienable rights, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The purpose of government is to protect or to secure our God-given, unalienable rights. Two questions. First of all, why are these unalienable rights? It's because of where they came from. These rights don't come from government, they come from God. And if they come from God, no earthly man or organization, no government has the authority to take these rights from us. Now, the next question is then, if government is engaged in anything besides that, are they really fulfilling their proper role of government? If government's doing something other than protecting our rights, they're probably doing something they should not be. And that's probably the simplest test I've ever heard for what is really constitutional and what is not. Is it, when it comes down to it, protecting our God-given unalienable rights, or is it doing something else? Now with that, I want to compare these core principles to the principles that the Charter of the United Nations is founded on. Now first of all, this started off with a recognition that there is a God, and that God is the grantor of our rights. Now, the Charter of the United Nations never mentions God. And when you take God out of this picture, what happens to our unalienable rights? If they don't come from God, well, they must come from government. And if they come from government, then government can take them away. And so by removing those things, these unalienable rights now become conditional rights. And the limited purpose of government now becomes unlimited. And that's exactly the philosophy that the United Nations is built upon. In fact, they have this wonderful charter called the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which talks all about how important your rights are. Except there's this little clause in there that really destroys the whole meaning. It says, rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Think about what that's saying. Your rights cannot be exercised in any way that's contrary to our agenda. In other words, you can have your rights as long as they don't get in our way. How does that compare to unalienable? Well, that's just the opposite, isn't it? That's directly contrary to the principles that our nation was founded on in the Declaration of Independence, of having unalienable rights, and then the Constitution written to protect those unalienable rights. What this means to me is that this United Nations concept is incompatible with the principles our nation was founded upon, this republic we're pledging our allegiance to. And either we must end our membership with the United Nations, or we must give up the principles our nation was founded on. They cannot coexist for long. So next, 4 key principles. The first one actually comes from the next part of the Declaration of Independence, the very next line, the concept of delegated powers. After it says the purpose of government was to protect those God-given rights, it says then deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Who are the governed? We the people. We consent to government having certain power. Where did we give our consent to the federal government having power? Well, it's the Constitution. And again, as we've said before, if it's not on the list of delegated powers, then they don't have that power. The next concept, enumeration of powers. That's that list. There's the specific list of powers they were given. James Madison refers to this concept in Federalist number 41, where he says, for what purpose could the enumeration of particular powers be inserted if these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general power? We didn't mean to give Congress unlimited power. We gave them specific enumeration of powers. Why did we bother enumerating them if they can do anything they want? Couple that with what Alexander Hamilton says later in the Federalist Papers. He says that this enumeration of powers would be absurd as well as useless if they could do whatever they wanted, if we had unlimited government. Third principle here is the separation of powers. Now, this is one thing I do remember learning in grade school, and that is that we have three branches of government. An executive branch, which is the president and his departments. We have the legislative branch, U.S. Congress, the House and Senate. And then we have the judicial branch, the Supreme Court and the lesser courts. And certain powers are given to each that cannot be shared or crossed between them. There are certain powers, like the power to legislate. Remember before, we talked about in Lecture 2, all legislative powers, herein granted, are vested in Congress, which means that the power to legislate, the power to write law, is only in Congress, and that the president has no real constitutional power to write law, although he does it all the time. And I'm not speaking of any specific president. Every president in my lifetime has done so. But at the same time, there's no legislative power in the judiciary, and yet our Supreme Court creates new laws frequently. Clearly against this third principle of separation of powers. We'll cover some more concepts of separation of powers later today. The last one is the division of powers. This is that some of these powers are reserved to the people. The 10th Amendment covers that concept, that some powers are to the federal, some are to the state, and some are to the people. And so the question I ask is, whose jurisdiction is this concept? For example, the management of wolves, wildlife. Clearly, there's nowhere in the Constitution that there was an enumerated power for the federal government to control the wildlife within the states. So it's not in their jurisdiction. It could be in the states, it could be in the people, but that's up to we the people. If we delegate that power to our state, then the state might manage the wildlife, might manage the wolves. But in another state, the people could choose to not delegate it to the states, but maybe to their county, and on a county-by-county basis, they manage their wolves or other wildlife. It's a matter of jurisdiction, but clearly by the Constitution we know that it's not federal. It has nothing to do with their jurisdiction. So those are the four key principles that really are very foundational in understanding what it is we're pledging our allegiance to. I always refer to the Pledge of Allegiance as a citizen's oath of office. It's very similar to when an elected official raises their hand to the square and swears an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. Literally, when we the people pledge our allegiance to the flag and to the republic, we're doing the same thing. So, the topic at hand today, talking about constitutional war powers. First, I want to introduce you to just a few statements from the Founding Fathers that give us a feel for what was their concerns, what was on their mind as they were drafting the Constitution. Here, John Adams gives us a very concise statement. Great is the guilt of an unnecessary war. You'll see that they took great pains to make sure that our nation would not too easily go to war, that we'd only go to war when we really intended to, really needed to. Because if our nation goes to war too easily, it costs the lives and fortune of our nation and that of others when it's unnecessary to do so. Another one, this one from James Madison, he says, the means of defense against foreign danger historically have become the instruments of tyranny at home. They were very leery of having a powerful military force in the hands of this central government, the federal government as we call it. They had just been through King George using their military. Remember, they were all British citizens, so the Redcoats were our standing army. And we had just gone through our own standing army being used against our own people to enforce tyranny of King George. And so they're very leery of creating that same kind of power and giving it to the president. In fact, in the Federalist Papers, James Madison goes through this in great detail, somewhere around 25 through 29, Federalist numbers 25 through 29. He examines this problem of how do you, on the one hand, have enough military power ready to go to defend your nation against a foreign invasion at a moment's notice. And on the other hand, you don't have this powerful military at the beck and call of the president to use to enforce tyranny. It was quite a problem that they debated extensively. It's a little late. If you don't have a standing army, it's a little late to start recruiting when someone's already invading your territory. You better have them trained and ready to go. And so the solutions they came up with, I find, are just brilliant, absolutely inspired. Alexander Hamilton goes on to explain some of their concerns as well. Federalist number 8. He says, safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. The violent destruction of life and property incident to war will compel nations, the most attached to liberty, to resort for repose and security to institutions which have a tendency to destroy their civil and political rights. And then his conclusion kind of sums it up. He says, to be more safe, they run the risk of being less free. So again, if we have too powerful of a military force in order to be as safe as possible, we risk going right back to where we were, with King George having that military power to enforce his tyranny. So you see the concerns they have. Now let me demonstrate to you the incredible solutions they came up with. As we turn into the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, you may recall, can be separated into two categories. The enumerated powers in Section 8, and in this version that would be on page 17. The first portion of Article 1, Section 8 are the general welfare powers. And then as we get to Clause 10, which says to define and punish piracies, that's where we start into the common defense powers. Clauses 10 through 16. So we'll be going through most of those. We'll actually start with 11, right at the bottom of the page 17, where Congress has the power to declare war. I think that's pretty clear, isn't it? If it says here, Article 1, Section 8, the Congress shall have power to, and then you jump down to Clause 11, to declare war. Who can declare war? Congress. There's not really any gray area here, is there? When was the last time that Congress declared war? Well, that was World War II. Have we been involved in any wars since then? Quite a few. And yet Congress hasn't declared war once since then. How did we get into war without Congress ever declaring war? Well, it's been by circumventing the Constitution. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail here in a moment. So clearly, though, the power to declare war was given to Congress and not to the President. Since then, it's been the President taking us into war, generally referencing United Nations resolutions that he's enforcing. Looking to the United Nations for his authority. Well, the United Nations doesn't give our President authority over the Constitution. He must abide by the Constitution. That's where his oath is. James Madison, explaining this concept that war-making powers must be held in Congress and not the President, he says he felt that in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department, not to the President. In fact, Abraham Lincoln summed this up very well as he was explaining his understanding of why in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 they gave this power to Congress and not to the President. He's responding here to a letter where someone felt really the President should have the power to declare war, and he's rebuking them. He says, the provision of the Constitution giving the war-making power to Congress was dictated, as I understand it, by the following reasons. Kings had always been involving and impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally, if not always, that the good of the people was the object. Then he goes on, this our convention understood to be the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions. Wow, that's quite an indictment. He goes on, they resolved to so frame the Constitution that no one man should hold the power of bringing this oppression upon us. But your view, he's referring back to this man that thought presidents should declare war, your view destroys the whole matter and places our president where kings have always stood. Our president is no king. And they clearly understood the tyranny. They personally had experienced the tyranny of a king having the power to declare war and execute the war. That is how King George was able to do it. They wanted to separate those powers. So clearly, power to declare war must be in the hands of Congress to deliberate, to argue back and forth whether or not it's in the best interest of our nation. Now, as we continue on to the next page here, Clause 12, top of page 18, it says Congress has the power to raise and support armies. But notice what it says next. No appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Congress can only appropriate money for this army for up to 2 years, no longer than. They could appropriate it for 2 months or however long they want, up to 2 years. Why did they choose 2 years, by the way? Congress is a 2-year session, and they can only fund up until the next Congress convenes. And then the next Congress can vote whether or not we want to continue funding our standing army. This is clearly intended to make the army a temporary structure. That they raise the army. This isn't a maintain. Notice what it says in the next clause. Congress is to provide and maintain a navy. Very different from the way they're treating an army. The navy is supposed to be an ongoing, maintained military force. There's no limit to the appropriation of money because we wanted to always have a navy, whereas the army was supposed to be temporary. And why would that be? Well, again, going back to their primary concern, a navy is very difficult to use against your own people to enforce your tyranny. And yet a standing army is very powerful at doing such a thing. They also knew that to raise a navy takes a great deal of time. They wanted to build up their navy and have it as a defense, because a navy is primarily defensive, whereas the army could be used against your people. So now we have the problem, how do you have a powerful military to defend your nation against invasions? Because again, if it's a land invasion, our navy isn't going to help a whole lot. How do we do that? How do we have a powerful resistance against invasion and yet not have a standing army in the hands of the king, or president in this case, that could be used against us? And the solution they came up with, I found, was brilliant. The next part is they have the power to call forth the militia. That was to be our first line of defense. If we don't at that time have a standing army ready to defend the nation, the militia of each state was supposed to be trained on a regular basis. In fact, as we go on to the next part, it talks about that training, but ready to be called forth by the Congress. The next portion, it actually says, the next clause, to make rules for governing regulation of land and naval forces. Then the next one, to call forth the militia. Notice what it says for. Congress has the power to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. That's our first line of defense when a land invasion happens. And then the next clause, clause 16, says that Congress has the power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, those that they have called forth. But reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So we'll break this down for a moment. Congress has the power to organize, arm. It's actually their duty to organize, arm, and discipline the militia. But the states appoint the officers and actually execute the training. The militia is generally in the hands of the states, except when called forth by Congress. Now this is an interesting power. Congress, first of all, setting the rules of training, you could call it, the disciplining, organizing, arming, and disciplining. And then at the end it says, according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So Congress sets the standards of training for this militia, so that when they call forth the militia from Montana and Arizona and everywhere else, that we're trained to the same standards, and that we don't have 50 different calibers of rifles that we're all using, and they have to figure out, okay, these are the calibers that Arizona needs, and this is the caliber for... It becomes very complex when you have many different states pulled together into one fighting force. And so they set a standard for their training and their arming and so on, so they could easily come together as one, as a defensive force. But for the most part, the power over the militia is in the hands of the states, except when called forth. And by nature of that fact, throughout our history, there have been many times when Congress has called forth the militia and the state has said, no, we don't feel this is a valid use of our militia. We feel you're abusing your power and we're not sending our militia. That became a check against abuse, didn't it? That Congress would have to raise an army, they don't always have one, And if they want to call forth the militia, there is someone that could intervene there. Very interesting. The power is there, but it's also has some checks against its abuse. Now, the next thing I want to go into is this militia. If you talk to the average person on the street about a militia, they'll think of what they've seen in the news media, of some rogue group up somewhere out in the countryside that got out of control. They got caught making plans for overthrowing our government or whatever else. That's not a militia. They may call themselves a militia, but that's not a true constitutional militia. A true constitutional militia is under the jurisdiction of the Congress and the state in which they reside. They answer to the two of those and are organized by them. In fact, the other answer that I often hear is, well, isn't the militia the same thing as our National Guard? And no, that's not really the case either. Let me demonstrate for you. First of all, I want to point to the Second Amendment. And those that are big gun rights advocates generally focus on the second half of the Second Amendment, that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But we miss the importance of the first half of it. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That's why the people must be able to have the right to bear arms. A well-regulated militia is necessary to our security. Interesting. Let me demonstrate why that is so. By comparing a National Guard to a true constitutional militia, there are many things we could compare. I'll just choose three. First of all, who is the National Guard? Well, it consists of those who choose to volunteer, to enlist. Constitutional militia historically was everyone. Everyone was required to be in their state militia. Every able-bodied man between the ages of, and then it varied from state to state what the age range was, might be 16 to 65 or whatever. Today, with men and women still serving in military purposes, it would be every person, perhaps. Every person between the ages of, 15 or 16, maybe up to 55 or 65, something like that. Every able-bodied, meaning that if someone was deemed that they didn't have the physical capacity to participate, they would be given a waiver. But otherwise, it was your duty to serve. And you could be fined for not showing up to your militia training meetings of the month. And in fact, the next one here, where are the arms stored? This is another interesting difference. When you do your service with the National Guard and then it's time to go home again, do you bring your guns home? Do you bring the tanks home? Park them in your driveway? No. They're stored by the government, aren't they? You leave them at the armory. Government keeps the control of those weapons. Whereas in the constitutional militia, you were required to keep your guns in your home, ready to go at a moment's notice. In fact, they would do inspections. That they would go around home to home and make sure that you had a certain amount of ammunition and powder ready to go in a satchel where you could grab your gun, grab the satchel, and you're out the door. And if you were found unprepared, you could be fined, that you're not armed and ready to go. Very interesting. So here we have the arms stored in the homes, that military power then being with the people. And then the last one here, can they be deployed abroad? Now remember, back a few clauses here. This would be in Clause 15. It said that Congress has the power to call forth the militia for three purposes. That was to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Which one of those has to do with being deployed to Iraq? None of them. The constitutional militia cannot be called forth into foreign service. For that purpose, they would have to raise an army. And so, clearly, we are deploying our National Guard abroad, so the answer to that would be yes, they can. And the constitutional militia cannot be engaged in foreign conflicts. They are a defensive force only. Now, of course, when we do raise the army, who do you raise it from? You do raise it from the general body of the people. So those that were serving in the militia could then enlist as part of the army. They'd be the same people. But the actual structure of the militia cannot be called forth abroad. Very different. Now, I want to emphasize a point here with a quote from, I don't too often quote the enemies, but Mao Zedong does give us a very good pointer here, and that is, he says, political power comes from the barrel of a gun. In this first structure, National Guard, who holds that barrel of the gun? Who controls it? Those arms are stored by the government. They're in the control of the government. In a constitutional militia, this barrel of the gun power is in the people, isn't it? That's probably the most stark difference between a constitutional militia and a National Guard. The political power of the barrel of the gun is in the people here. And if you're in a country where every person is required to be armed and trained on a regular basis with their arms, it would be foolish to invade such a country. Very much. And so you can see why that is the first line of the Second Amendment. The security of a free state is dependent upon having a well-regulated militia. It's very clear why that is now. So going back to prior to 1913, to understand how the war powers all fit together. Because certain things were changed in 1913, it changes the way our war powers work. And then we'll give you a big picture of how it all works together. So first of all, prior to the 16th and 17th Amendments and prior to the Federal Reserve, here's how our system used to work. That first of all, the people here would directly elect our U.S. Congressmen, House of Representatives. And then prior to the 17th Amendment, it was the state legislature which would select our U.S. senators. So the congressmen, the House reps, would answer to the people, the senators would answer to the state. Now very interestingly, let's say the people, like we talked about in Lecture 1, recognize, hey, we can vote ourselves money from the public treasury. We want more money. They tell their congressman, please propose a bill that gives us more benefits from the public treasury. They propose that bill, it goes over to the Senate. The Senate answers to the states. And prior to the 16th Amendment, the federal government couldn't tax the people directly. They typically did their taxing to the state, and the state would tax the people. If they wanted to raise more money, the state legislature would say, I don't know, let's check. Should we increase taxes? They say to their people. And the people say, no more taxes. And so the state legislators say to their senators, don't pass this bill because if we raise the taxes to help you fund it, the people will be upset with us. You see how this works? It makes a nice little circle that checks against the government growing too much. The people in the end have to pay for it anyway. This way, we have our state legislatures that we're directly in contact with, they're closest to the people, saying, we don't want you to raise our taxes. And then they kill the bill. That was a nice structure, kept federal government in check. In particular, applying this to war. If the people feel there's a significant enough threat that we need to go to war, yes, we're willing to put our lives on the line for this war declaration. And the House declares war. The Senate then, speaking to their state legislature, does the legislature feel that there's enough threat they're willing to raise taxes to fund the war? And if the state legislature supports the Senate then declares war. Only then do we get a declaration of war. Do you see how that would be more rare than the way we're doing it today with just the president saying we're going to war now? And then we're going to fund it without anyone noticing? Here's the way it works now. Now that we've passed the 16th and 17th Amendments, the federal government can tax the people directly. The people are electing both our U.S. House and U.S. Senate directly. And the taxes do come directly from us, and the state legislature is totally left out of the picture, aren't they? Now, the federal government asking the people, can we increase taxes to pay for this war? And the people say, no, we don't want any more taxes. What do they do now? They say, if we can't raise taxes, but we still want to spend the money, we just created a new thing called this Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve can just print the money, which in effect, as we covered in Lecture 3, still does take the money from the people, but in a manner that, as the quote went, not one man in a million can diagnose. You don't see this tax, it's a hidden tax, but they're still taking our money. It's just a more quiet way of taxing the people. And it's much easier to get bills through because you don't see the resistance from the people. It's much easier to go to war. I firmly believe that today, if each one of us were sent a bill on a monthly basis for our share of our war efforts, that there would be a large outcry against the war, where there isn't right now because we don't directly see that cost. So it's a good way of hiding the expense from the people so they can do it anyway. So now that's the grand big picture here. We have many different checks against going to unnecessary war put into the Constitution. The army is temporary. The militia can be called forth, but only for defensive purposes. And only when Congress declares war, both the House and the Senate, do you then feel comfortable that we have a nation united in the war effort. When our nation's united in the war effort, we never lose. We've only declared war 5 times in our history. I told you it'd be rare. Only 5 times. The War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, and World War I and World War II. How do we do in those wars, by the way? We won. We won all of them, soundly. How have we done in the wars we've been involved in since then that we didn't declare? Not so well. I think there's a concept here that we're missing, that maybe if we actually go through the constitutional method of declaring war, there's some power behind it. There is. That we always win, and we win definitively, and it's a short order. You don't have these long, drawn-out wars that never seem to resolve. So with that great wisdom, I want to go to some additional great quotes. This man by the name of Hermann Göring, was one of Adolf Hitler's top men. And during the Nazi war trials, the Nuremberg war trials they called it, he made a very interesting observation. He said, "Of course the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor in Germany for that matter. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of a country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy, or a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist dictatorship. You can always lead the people into war." Now, the person interviewing him from America, Dr. Gustav Gilbert here, replies to him, "There is one difference. In a democracy, the people have some say in the matter through their elected representatives, and in the United States, only Congress can declare wars." Well, he's exactly right. Unfortunately, we've abandoned that principle. But Mr. Göring counters him and says, "Oh, that's all well and good, but voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to do the bidding of their leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked, and then denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country." I'm afraid that as I began learning these principles, that sounded all too familiar to me. This idea of telling us we're being attacked and then denouncing the pacifists for lack of patriotism. Don't you support the troops? Well, sure, but that doesn't mean I support their misuse. Now, a little more recently, General Douglas MacArthur pointed to this very same thing happening in our day. He says, "Our government has kept us in a perpetual state of fear, kept us in a continuous stampede of patriotic fervor, with the cry of grave national emergency. Always there has been some terrible evil at home or some monstrous foreign power that was going to gobble us up if we did not blindly rally behind it." See, the power of war is a great way to control your own people, as well as conquering other nations. There's a great amount of liberties that are lost for the cause of war. Norman Vincent Peale summed it up rather succinctly here. He says, "Americans used to roar like lions for liberty. Now we bleat like sheep for security." Very much some of the concerns that I pointed out from our founding fathers, that for the sake of security, we'd be willing to sacrifice our essential liberties. George Washington gave us a great warning on our foreign policy here. He says, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending to our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible." What's he advocating? We should have commercial relations with foreign nations, but to be tied to them as little as possible. We shouldn't have foreign treaties and arrangements and things like that, just free trade. A very simple foreign policy. John Quincy Adams gave us another warning. America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Our military is to be used to protect us. That's their purpose. That's what we fund them for, and that's what our lives are for. Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, also said it quite succinctly, where he says, "What would be wrong with simply minding our own business?" I like that logic. So, this was the traditional conservative viewpoint when it came to foreign relations and foreign wars. And it continued all the way through the 1940s and 50s, and we began to see a shift as we got into the 60s and 70s. We have, for example, Senator Robert Taft, who was known as Mr. Republican and was very much a non-interventionist when it came to foreign policy, to not interfere with the affairs of other nations, but to freely trade with them. Now, as we come today to modern conservatives, we see a very different brand of conservative. George Bush, for example, here, George W., during his presidency, he signed, toward the end of his presidency, this economic bailout, this stimulus package, and a TARP bill, this trouble relief program to bail out the banks that were too big to fail. Very clearly Keynesian socialist economics, some of the topics that we covered in Lecture 3. That is not the economic theory of a free market system, nor the traditional economic theory of a conservative. He also declared in his defense, "I had to abandon free market principles in order to save the free market." It doesn't sound like he believes that free markets would work. Now, I should also point out that he wasn't trying to save the free market because we weren't working under a free market at the time. The problems that we had were caused by government intervention, and were supposed to be solved by, of course, more government intervention. Next, he expanded the Medicaid prescription drug program, which is clearly socialist welfare spending, and sent American troops to war without having Congress first declare war, circumventing the Constitution. And incidentally, in this process of going abroad to war, what was their purpose? We're spreading democracy. I think we covered pretty well in Lecture 1 the dangers of spreading democracy. It always leads to a socialist state. Is this what a conservative is? I'll tell you, this was about the time when I was beginning to understand that my political viewpoints were in conflict with principles of liberty in the Constitution. I voted for George Bush. And now I'm feeling like maybe I made a mistake. This is not a conservative constitutional viewpoint that he's putting forward. What is going on with a conservative? If he's a conservative, what am I? Because I'm clearly not that. And the problem is he's not a conservative. We're mislabeling him. He's not a liberal, but he's not a conservative. What is he? Well, there's a term that's called neoconservative. When I first heard this, I thought it was just a slur, a slander against certain political viewpoints. It's not. The neoconservative name is actually one that neoconservatives have given to themselves. And over the next few slides, I'll demonstrate to you exactly what they define themselves as. But when you consider George Bush to be a neoconservative, then all these policies fit perfectly with the definition of a neoconservative. So let's see what that is. First of all, their origins. Back in 1972, Irving Kristol, who declares himself to be the godfather, kind of the founding father of the neoconservative movement, Irving Kristol points to their history saying in 1972, the nomination of George McGovern signified that the Democratic Party was not hospitable to any degree of neoconservatism. Only a few of us drew the obvious conclusion that we would have to try to find a home in the Republican Party. But with every passing year, our numbers grew. More and more people migrated from the Democrat Party to the Republican Party because they rejected the George McGovern version of Democratic Party, which was an open embracing of the hippie movement and things of that nature. And so very much we saw a migration from the Democrat Party and an infiltration of the Republican Party, steering the Republican Party in a new direction, that of neoconservative. And again, what is a neoconservative? Irving Kristol wrote a fairly definitive book on the topic called Neoconservatism. In there he tells us, for example, we, the neoconservatives, accepted the New Deal in principle and had little affection for the kind of isolationism that then permeated American conservatism. We'll spend a moment on each of those 2 points, the New Deal and isolationism. First of all, what was the New Deal? Of course, we all know under FDR, he implemented the New Deal, this massive socialist welfare program, really. Created massive government expansion of departments, bureaus, agencies, and deepened the Great Depression of the 1930s. By any free market economist's assessment, it caused the 1930s to be this Great Depression rather than a little blip. In fact, it's an interesting comparison to compare the Great Depression of 1920s, which never happened, but had bigger causes that should have caused a Great Depression than the 1930s did. And by lack of government intervention in the 1920s, we never had that depression. Whereas the 1930s, the government intervention caused it to be much worse than it otherwise would have been. Now, the other part I want to go into is isolationism. He was referring to this isolationism that permeated the Republican Party prior to them invading it. Isolationism is having no dealings with foreign nations at all. You shut down your borders, you don't trade with them, you don't go to war, you don't do anything, you just defend yourself and you're isolated. Now, he was saying that the viewpoints in the Republican Party at that time was isolationist. Clearly not the case. They truly wanted open and free trade with foreign nations. So he was mislabeling it, trying to slander their viewpoints. But truly what the traditional Republican viewpoint was that of non-interventionism, which is very different from isolationism. It is simply staying out of the affairs and wars of other nations while openly trading with them. Now, this concept of war, concept of a just war, I want to go into just briefly. You remember John Adams, great is the guilt of an unnecessary war. The only war that's really necessary is when you're trying to defend yourself in one manner or another, which sometimes might need to be going abroad in defense to finally cut off a problem that's continuing to invade you. But nonetheless, it always must be defensive. It must be formally declared by the proper authority, which in our country is Congress declaring war constitutionally. It must have a just cause. It must be for good reasons and have a good intention of why we're going to war. It must be the last resort. John Adams' presidency, one of his greatest legacies was his avoiding of war with France. How very carefully he walked the line between the two opposing political parties, one wanting him to go to war against France and the other saying, you're not doing enough to appease them. And he walked the line very carefully between those two to avoid war. It must have limited and unchanging objectives. You don't go into war for one purpose and, hey, while we're here, let's do this and this too. That clearly violates number 3, among other things, just cause and right intention. It must be proportionate means. It means that you're not just going in to level the entire country of every living thing, but only those that are military combatants, which goes right into number 7, that non-combatants would have immunity. We don't try for civilian casualties. That would be just war. That was the traditional vision that our founding fathers had when we did need to go to war. These were the general considerations that they held. Now, contrary to that, today we have a new concept, that of preemptive war. The type of war that is not defensive, it's an act of aggression. It's a type of war that started without being attacked and without any certain expectation of being attacked. Just that they might be a threat to us, so we better go in there and conquer them before they become such. Clearly the opposite of just war. Now, going back to Irving Kristol again, he gives us a little more insight here. He says the conservative welfare state is perfectly consistent with the neoconservative perspective. What's a conservative welfare state? That seems to me to be a contradiction of terms. But again, perfectly consistent. So that gives us one of the keys to what a neoconservative is. They definitely support a welfare state, like the New Deal. And interventionist foreign policy. They don't believe in this isolationism, as he labeled it, including spreading democracy. Those are 2 key points of what a neoconservative stands for then. Socialist welfare programs at home and foreign interventionism and spreading democracy. The third point that I want to make was the most surprising to me. He says, I regard myself lucky to have been a young Trotskyite and have not one single bitter memory. He's a Trotskyite? You all know who Trotsky was, right? We'll go into that in just a moment. Speaking of the rise of neoconservatism, the other important influence on neoconservatives was the legacy of Trotsky. In the framework of international communism, the Trotskyites were rabid internationalists rather than realists or nationalists. Now on this note for just a moment, Y'all remember what Nazi stands for? It's for National Socialism, right? Nazis aren't the political opposite of a socialist or a communist. They're very similar in many ways. It's another form of big government. But they were National Socialists, where Trotskyites were international communists. And yet they openly point to Trotsky's international communist viewpoint as an important influence on the philosophy of neoconservatism. So Leon Trotsky, let's go into who he was. Leon Trotsky, first of all, in 1917, he had partnered with Lenin, led to the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrew Russia and created communist Russia. So clearly he is a Marxist, a communist, and as we probably well know with Russian history, that led to a very dark time in their history. Murder of many of their own people. Thousands and thousands and thousands of their own people. Very brutal, brutal regime. But then Stalin comes along, even worse, murders millions of his own people. Leon Trotsky partnered with Stalin for a short time, and they discovered they had irreconcilable differences. Enough so that Stalin issued an extermination order on Trotsky. Trotsky had to flee the country for his life. Now, exiled by Stalin, eventually Stalin's people did catch up with Trotsky in Mexico, and he was murdered. But Trotsky, throughout his entire life, never ceased working for total government. He always was a totalitarian Marxist, just of a different style than Stalin. In particular, and with the separation between Trotsky and Stalin, it divided Marxism into two camps. So those that look to Karl Marx today typically identify with either Stalin or Trotsky as what version of Marxism they adhere to. There's a division now. Okay, so here's our three main points. Socialist welfare programs, interventionist foreign policy, including wars, spreading democracy, that word internationalist was used, and Trotsky-style Marxism defines a neoconservative. I find that astounding. Now here's a few prominent names you might recognize that helped Irving Kristol with this takeover of the Republican Party. One, William F. Buckley Jr., founder of the National Review magazine, and then also Robert Bartley, editor of the Wall Street Journal. Let's go into each of them for just a moment. First of all, William F. Buckley Jr. This book here, written by John McManus, president of the John Birch Society a number of years ago, goes into the history of William F. Buckley and his role in helping create the neoconservative movement. This book, Pied Piper for the Establishment, is an excellent understanding of both the history of neoconservatism as well as his role in it. Now in here, he quotes William F. Buckley, Jr., declaring, "We have got to accept big government for the duration, the instrument of a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores, and the attendant centralization of power in Washington." Now again, does that sound conservative to you? Not very. That's very fitting with the neoconservative, though. But notice the year. 2 decades before they finally founded the neoconservative movement, William F. Buckley was already a neoconservative. Now, Joseph Sobran, who worked for 21 years with William F. Buckley at National Review, finally was, as he became more and more aware of some of what was going on there at National Review, he was, as it says here, unceremoniously dismissed. He was kicked out. Now, I've enjoyed Joseph Sobran's articles through the years. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple years ago. But he has always been a very solid conservative, not neoconservative. And much of the National Review has always been truly conservative, not neoconservative. But it was because of that fact that it positioned William F. Buckley to have the ear of true conservatives and to gradually lead them into this new conservative. That's what neoconservative means, is the new conservative, as he redefined it. Joseph Sobran, upon reading this book, William F. Buckley Jr., Pied Piper for the Establishment, he says, "John McManus has gathered together a mountain of damning but firmly documented data about William F. Buckley Jr. American conservatism's longtime intellectual leader has been a calamity for conservatism." As John McManus met with Joseph Sobran, saw he had a copy of the book, wanted him to sign it. He says, "Oh, have you read the book?" He says, I read it twice. And he starts showing him the dog-eared pages and written in margins. He'd gone through the entire book and said to him, "If only I had known this when I was working for him." The other media personality we mentioned earlier that helped with the takeover of the Republican Party was Robert Bartley of the Wall Street Journal. And this statement, I think, pretty clearly defines his political viewpoints here. He says, Mexican President Vicente Fox suggests that NAFTA should evolve into something like the European Union with open borders. He can rest assured that there is one voice north of the Rio Grande that supports his vision, to wit, this newspaper, meaning himself. Very clearly an open borders advocate. We need to create a globalist union here. Now, the neoconservatives started an organization known as Project for the New American Century back in 1997. And I find it very interesting, some of the things that they openly declared were their objectives. First of all, they called for the United States to use our military power to meet global responsibilities. We could summarize that as policing the world. The next one was to strengthen its ties with its allies, very opposite of what George Washington was suggesting we should do, having as little to do with them as possible. So, unnecessary entangling alliances. We should challenge regimes that are hostile to our values. Preemptive wars. And then we should also insist on political and economic freedom abroad, but the form of freedom that's supposed to be is through spreading democracy, not a true constitutional republic. And then they called for the creation of an international order. That is clearly world government globalism. These are the things that the Project for the New American Century stood for. Now, shockingly, the next one was even more surprising to me, and that is that in the year 2000, September of 2000, they declared a need for another Pearl Harbor type event that would galvanize the American people to support their ambitious plans to ensure political and economic domination of the world. In particular, they had plans for restructuring the Middle East. In the year 2000, we need a new Pearl Harbor. And coincidentally, they got their wish almost exactly 1 year later, September of 2001. Who were the signatories? Here are some of the people that signed on to the Project for New American Century. You might recognize especially the top three, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz. Other names you might recognize as well. I want to focus on the top three because we'll follow them now and what they did next. First of all, the Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz trio wanted Bush 1 to reinvade Iraq in '92 and to finish the job, to completely get rid of its leader and spread democracy. Unfortunately, Bush was not re-elected in '93, so the three formed the Project for New American Century and began petitioning Clinton to do the same thing, to invade Iraq, to topple its leader, and to create democracy. Unfortunately, Clinton was a little too busy with his personal matters. We won't go into that. And Gingrich really didn't ever sign on to this plan either. So along comes Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, given top posts in with the second Bush presidency, and they were all in positions of foreign policy. They immediately resumed urging another invasion of Iraq prior to 9/11, and finally, with the event of 9/11, they had their crisis for the people their Pearl Harbor event, we could say, for the people to back them in this move. As Rahm Emanuel says, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. They certainly put it to good use for their objectives, didn't they? Now, George W. Bush, in his presidency, as we mentioned, he selected the three, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, as topmost assistants. He obtained authorization to invade Iraq from U.S. Congress? No. Oh yes, from the United Nations. That's a little bit contrary to what the Constitution says and what we covered earlier today. Next, forcing democracy on other nations and more socialism and steady escalating indebtedness for our nation. That sums up his efforts under their guidance and direction. Now, interestingly, of these three, Donald Rumsfeld, as we have on our feature article here called Neocon Control, was awarded the Defender of the Constitution Award at CPAC back in 2011. I find that a little ironic considering he was one of the most avid in violating the Constitution. And because of the ignorance of many of those at CPAC, he was the defender of the Constitution. I don't mean to speak ill of those that voted for him in this regard, but it just shows that we're ignorant of the Constitution. Even within the conservative side of things here, we're very ignorant of the Constitution and don't recognize those within our ranks that are not one of us, that are working against the principles of liberty. And I was as guilty as anyone. I was a neocon without knowing it. I supported this big government programs, especially the war powers and things of that nature. Next, Mark Gerson. The neoconservatives have so changed conservatism that what we now identify as conservatism is largely what was once neoconservatism. And in so doing, they have defined the way vast numbers of Americans view their economy, their polity, and their society. And I must say that did describe me as well before I began understanding what we're covering today. Samuel Francis, he also points out the whole concept of conservatism in America is virtually devoid of meaning, in large part because conservatives have made the seminal error of allowing dilettantes like Mr. Buckley to define it for them in the first place. We've allowed him to redefine what a conservative is. Now, prominent neoconservatives that are also members of the Council on Foreign Relations. You might recognize a few of these faces or names. In particular, Dick Cheney, prominent neoconservative, Council on Foreign Relations member. Charles Krauthammer is one I've seen on Fox News a lot lately. He is a common commentator, I guess you could say. Newt Gingrich, wasn't he running for political office somehow recently? Oh yeah, president. And John McCain in the last round running for president as well. Who's Rupert Murdoch? Well, here's your little clue. You have the little logo in the background here, Fox News. He's the owner of the Fox News media empire and a Council on Foreign Relations neoconservative. Now, just to make things a little more confusing, I thought that Obama was clearly the liberal in the race. But because Obama has turned on his own statements about war in order to promote the Libyan incursion, Obama is now a born-again neocon, says William Kristol, son of Irving Kristol, the founder of neoconservatism. William Kristol is also a very prominent neoconservative. He's kind of gloating that, hey, look, Obama's joined our ranks, spreading the war front. So, just to make things a little more confusing, it seems that the two parties are almost identical, doesn't it? Carroll Quigley pointed to this as one of their objectives, that the two parties should be almost identical, so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. And I'm afraid that's what we generally get at the general elections, is a choice between two very similar candidates. Quick review. We covered those 3 points of what a neoconservative stands for: socialist welfare, interventionist foreign policy, and spreading democracy. They look to Trotsky as their leader. Mostly it's Republicans that are neoconservatives, though sometimes they are still on the Democrat side of the ticket. They always claim to support the troops. I don't know. Supporting the troops by sending them off into wars that aren't for our own best interests, I'm not sure if that's supporting them. But they emphatically support war and consistently back socialist legislation. And they want the United States to remain entangled in the United Nations, despite the fact that we covered earlier that it's directly in conflict with our own founding principles. Ron Paul gives us a good concluding definition here. He says, neoconservatism is not the philosophy of free markets and a wise foreign policy. Instead, it represents big government welfare at home and a program to spread their version of American values throughout the world. Good, concise definition. So, if in the next presidential general election you have a choice between a liberal, a Stalinist on the one hand, and a Trotskyite as the conservative, who would you vote for? Not much of a choice, really, is there? And really the difference between the two is that the Stalinist tends to focus their energies more on the home front, in the welfare state, although they do expand the warfare front a little bit, like Obama's doing. Whereas a Trotskyite puts more of their energy into the warfare front and less into the welfare front. And if you compare the last two presidents, Obama has certainly focused much more on the welfare front with his new health care law. And yes, he has expanded the war front a little bit. You look at George W. Bush. He expanded the war front tremendously, but he did increase the welfare state as well. It's a matter of degrees of what their emphasis is going to be. It's not a difference in principles and fundamentals. They're not opposites. It's just where do we want to put the emphasis. Again, the two parties are almost identical. For additional study, being that this is a very concise exposure to some of what's going on here, I highly recommend a couple things here. There's an article called Neocon Control, and then there's a book called The Shadows of Power. The Shadows of Power can be found at shopjbs.org. And then this article you can look up and just read it online. If you go to thenewamerican.com and do a search for Neocon Control, or if you even look up Neocon, you'll find Neocon Control. This article does a great job of showing where we are today, as well as the history in more depth than I have time to cover today, of the neoconservative movement, who they are, what they stand for. It's vital that we understand those who are working against freedom, so that we are not duped, like I was, into voting for those that are intent to destroy the Constitution. With that, that concludes lecture number 4. Thank you for joining us today.